All right, diving into something a little bit heavier today.
Yeah.
But something that I think a lot of our listeners are going to relate to. And
Sure.
that is the emotional side of separation,
Yeah.
particularly when we're talking about long-term relationships.
All right.
And, and we've said this before, but it's worth repeating. It's likely that many of our listeners out there
Right.
are either facing this themselves, maybe considering it,
Yeah.
or they know someone who is going through this.
Yeah, definitely.
So for this deep dive, we're trying to understand this challenging period, and you brought us two really interesting sources. One is a podcast transcript
Yeah.
where Christian couples talk about the impact of separation on their faith.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is a video from a relationship coach who talks about the grief of separation.
Yeah, and I thought it was super interesting how those two sources kind of had a lot in common, even though they're coming from two different perspectives.
Well, and that was the thing that I noticed right away was that I was reading through the podcast transcript first.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that jumped out was this idea that separation is like grieving a death,
Right.
which, it's not just a breakup. It's like losing a part of yourself.
Yeah, that's a powerful analogy. I think that's why people sometimes just try to rush through it.
Right.
Or just try to get over it like you would a normal breakup or something. But
Yeah.
no, this is like you're losing a part of yourself and you have to actually grieve that.
Yeah. And so both the podcast and this relationship coach in the video are saying, like, hold on. This is grief work.
Totally.
It takes time.
Yeah.
And the relationship coach he uses this analogy of like leveling up
Right.
in a video game.
Right.
And you can't just jump to the final level.
You can't skip stages.
You got to master each stage to move on.
Ex-
So what might some of those stages look like if you're kind of going through this grieving process? What do you have to master before you can move on?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to actually acknowledge how you feel.
Okay.
A lot of times people don't even want to touch that. They just want to avoid those uncomfortable emotions.
Right, right.
So you got to lean into that and then, start to understand why things went wrong,
Okay.
which is going to be painful, but it's important.
Yeah.
And then, eventually you'll be able to start to create a new normal for yourself.
Okay, so those are some of the stages. So now let's say someone's listening to this and they're thinking, man, I've been stuck in this.
Right.
Like for months.
Yeah.
How do they know if they're leveling up correctly or if they're stuck at a certain level?
That's a good question. The relationship coach, talks about some signs. Like, let's say if you're constantly blaming yourself or the other person for everything,
Okay.
you're probably stuck in anger. Or, if you're idealizing the past and you're not even able to see the problems clearly,
Mm-hmm.
you might be stuck in denial.
Okay.
So each stage has its own kind of, stuckness.
Okay. So there's kind of some benchmarks along the way that you can check in with yourself
Totally.
and say, am I doing the work or am I avoiding it?
Yeah, for sure.
Now, the podcast brought up something that I think a lot of our listeners will relate to.
Yeah.
Especially, we have a lot of folks who are people of faith that listen to this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And they talk about how even if you know the separation is the right thing to do,
Yeah.
it can clash with your values. Like values about lifelong marriage, the sanctity of family.
Right.
So it's almost like your head is saying one thing,
Mm.
but your heart and your upbringing is pulling you in another direction.
That's a powerful tension.
It is.
And it's a real struggle for a lot of people.
Yeah. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I think the coach kind of touches on that too, but from a more secular perspective.
He talks about how those values, things like commitment and family, they're good things,
Right.
but they can also trap people in relationships that are actually damaging.
Okay.
So it's almost like the value becomes the reason to stay miserable.
So it's like, how do we align our heads and our hearts?
Yeah, exactly.
But, I feel like that's kind of a vague thing.
It is vague. It's like, what does that even look
How
like?
does that look like in real life? How do you actually do that?
Well, the podcast talked about, having those honest conversations with yourself.
Okay.
Like journaling or praying about those feelings.
Okay.
And, maybe talking to a therapist
Mm-hmm.
or a pastor if you're a person of faith.
Okay.
But the coach gets even more specific.
Okay.
He actually thinks you should talk to yourself out loud.
Wait, what?
Yeah. Like look in the mirror and just have it out.
Seriously. So I'm looking in the mirror saying, mirror on the wall, should I stay or should I go?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. I know it sounds kind of strange, but
That's hilarious. But
it can be really effective.
so why does he think that works?
He says it helps you articulate those hidden thoughts and feelings.
Okay.
You know, the ones you're too afraid to tell even your closest friend.
Yeah.
You just get it out there, and then you can start to examine it.
Okay, so it's not just about having deep thoughts.
Right.
But it's about actually externalizing those thoughts in some way.
Exactly.
Whether it's through writing or even talking to the mirror.
Yeah.
But I could also see how that could be pretty intimidating.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when you're already feeling so vulnerable.
Yeah, if you're not comfortable talking to the mirror,
right.
He suggests writing. You know, get those thoughts down on paper.
Yeah.
The main thing is to externalize it.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, my wife is a writer, and she does that all the time. She'll just be writing in her journal, and then she'll come out, and she's like, oh, I just realized this thing, because she got it out of her head.
Exactly.
So, okay, so we've got this grief analogy. We've got this whole leveling up thing.
Yeah.
We've got getting real with ourselves. I'm starting to see how these pieces fit together.
It is all connected.
Now, I want to, both these sources keep coming back to this idea of clarity.
Yeah.
This process is about getting clarity.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, I think it means understanding why the separation is happening.
Okay.
What it means for you and what you want going forward.
Okay, so it's not just about the past. It's also about the future.
Exactly.
Now, the podcast also talked about needing to find peace with the decision to separate.
Right.
Even if it clashes with those really deep down values.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into this whole clarity thing?
Well, I think it's recognizing that the right decision, even if it's aligned with your true self, it can still bring up a lot of conflicting emotions.
Okay.
Especially if it goes against everything you were taught growing up.
Okay.
Or everything your community believes in.
So even if you know it's over, there's still this part of you that feels like maybe you're failing somehow.
Yeah, you're going against the grain.
Right.
And that's where the grief work comes in.
Okay.
You have to let yourself mourn that loss, mourn that ideal.
Okay.
Mourn the loss of what you thought your life would be.
Yeah, no, this is making me think about those situations where maybe one person is ready to walk away, but the other person is still holding on to hope.
Right.
Maybe trying to reconcile.
Yeah, that's common.
So how do we deal with that kind of mismatch?
The coach says it's important for both people to do their own self-reflection because if you're not on the same page about why you're separated, it's impossible to move forward.
Okay.
In a healthy way, at least.
So it's not just about figuring out your own stuff.
Right.
But it's about understanding where the other person is coming from.
Totally.
Even if ultimately you decide to go your separate ways.
Yeah, and that can be hard when there's a lot of hurt and resentment. But I think having that empathy for each other can make the whole process less painful.
Right, less combative.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about the grief, the leveling up, getting real with ourselves, and now this kind of empathy piece.
Right.
Starting to see how these pieces fit together.
Yeah, it's all part of the same puzzle.
Now, I think what's really encouraging about both these sources is that they emphasize that this isn't a dead end.
No, it's not the end.
It's a transition.
It's a new beginning.
And that these lessons we learn, they say, they impact way more than just your romantic life.
For sure.
So what else does it affect?
Well, the podcast specifically talks about how it affects your friendships.
Okay.
Like maybe you realize you've been settling for less than you deserve.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Or you become more aware of your own needs and boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that kind of self-discovery can be really powerful in a lot of different areas of your life.
So it's like once you've gone through this ringer, it changes your perspective on all kinds of relationships. And the coach talks about how the skills you learn during this time, that honesty with yourself, that willingness to face your emotions, those things can help you in your work life too.
Definitely.
You become better at setting boundaries and advocating for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like this experience, as painful as it is, can actually equip you to be a better friend.
Right.
A better colleague, a better communicator.
Totally.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really hopeful way to look at this.
It is hopeful. It's about taking something that feels like a loss and turning it into a catalyst for growth.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
And both of these sources really emphasize that you can come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more connected to yourself than ever before.
So it's almost like a refining process.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you're going through the fire, but you're coming out stronger.
You come out purified.
Yeah.
Like gold.
Yeah. Now I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of leveling up.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because I think that's a really powerful concept. But it can also be a little bit abstract.
Yeah.
So let's try to get really concrete about what that looks like in real life.
Okay, I'm game.
So how do we actually level up? We keep hearing about self-reflection,
Right.
but what are some specific things that people can do to really understand themselves better during this time?
Yeah. Okay, I get it. You want to get practical.
Yeah, give me the action steps.
All right, well, the relationship coach in the video talks about, building a strong foundation,
Right.
brick by brick.
Okay.
And each brick represents, like, a new piece of self-knowledge that you gain.
All right, I like that. So give me an example of a brick.
Okay, one brick could be, understanding your attachment style.
Oh yeah, attachment styles. I've heard about that, but to be honest, it always seemed a little too, like, theoretical for me.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Like, how does, knowing that I'm, whatever, avoidant or anxious or whatever, how does that actually help me in real life?
Well, the coach says that once you understand your attachment style, you can start to see the patterns in your relationships.
Okay.
Like maybe you realize you always pick partners who are emotionally unavailable
Right.
because that subconsciously mirrors your own childhood,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's about understanding those deeper patterns.
Yeah, and breaking free from them.
So now, what if someone is listening and they're thinking, look, I don't have time for therapy.
Right.
I don't have time for deep dives into attachment theory. I just need to get through this breakup.
Yeah, what do they do?
Yeah. What's the advice for those folks?
Well, the podcast actually talks about, focusing on the things you can control,
Okay.
even when everything feels chaotic.
Like what?
Like establishing routines, taking care of your physical health,
Yeah.
finding healthy ways to express your emotions.
Right. So it's about those basic self-care things.
Totally, because it's easy to let all that stuff slide when you're hurting,
Right.
but it's actually what can make you feel grounded and strong
Yeah.
so you can actually deal with the emotional stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. So those basic things really are important.
Super important.
Now, the podcast even suggests, like, creating a playlist
Oh, yeah, I love that idea.
of uplifting music or podcasts
Right, surround yourself with things that inspire you.
that nourish your soul.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's like being intentional about what you're taking in.
Yeah, and what you're feeding your mind
Exactly.
and your heart.
Yeah. That reminds me of something the relationship coach said about not letting the separation define you.
Yeah, that's huge.
It's easy to get caught up in that victim mentality.
Right. Woe is me, this is the end of my life.
But he's saying there's a choice to be made.
There is.
You can let this break you,
Yeah.
or you can let it make you stronger.
And he talks about how even though the separation might have been initiated by someone else, the way you respond to it is in your control.
I love that. That puts the power back in your own hands.
It does. It does.
But, honestly, I think there are times when the pain is just too big to even think about. Like leveling up
Yeah, for sure.
or finding a silver lining.
I totally get that.
Like, how do you even begin to do that when you're just feeling so much pain?
Well, both of those sources talk about how the grieving process can be messy and unpredictable.
Yeah.
So there will be days when you feel like you're taking 2 steps forward, 5 steps back.
Yeah.
And that's normal.
So it's not about pretending that everything is fine.
No.
It's about being honest about the struggle,
Yeah,
but still choosing to move towards something better.
that's it.
Yeah. So even when it hurts,
Even when it's hard.
you're still choosing to keep going.
Yes, exactly.
Now, the coach talks about how actually facing those difficult emotions head on
Right.
is what allows you to heal.
It is.
And he uses this metaphor of a wound.
Yeah, I like that metaphor.
Like if you keep covering it up with a bandage,
It'll never heal.
it'll never heal.
You gotta clean it out.
Yeah.
Let it air out, even though it stings.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we know when we've cleaned out the wound enough?
He doesn't give like a hard and fast rule
Yeah.
because everyone's journey is going to be different. But he says one sign is when you can start to see the separation as a learning experience,
Yep.
not just a failure.
Interesting.
So you're starting to see the bigger picture.
Instead of just feeling the pain.
Yeah, and maybe even feeling some gratitude for what you learned.
Okay, and that's a huge step toward finding peace with the decision.
Totally.
It doesn't mean you're happy about it,
Right.
but you're accepting it.
You're accepting it as part of your story.
Yeah, okay. Now, what about those values that we talked about before?
Yeah,
Those deep down values that might be clashing with this decision.
right.
How do we find peace when we feel like we're going against what we believe in?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
But I think both sources agree that it's about balance.
Okay.
It's not about abandoning your values, but it's also not about letting them dictate your life to the point where you're sacrificing your own well-being.
So it's about being true to yourself And honoring what you believe in,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's messy.
Exactly.
Okay, how do we do that?
Yeah.
Any practical tips?
The podcast suggests getting really clear on your non-negotiables.
Okay.
Like, what values are you absolutely not willing to compromise on, even in a relationship?
Okay, that's a great question to ask yourself.
It is.
What are my non-negotiable?
And then how can you live out those values in a way that also honors your own needs and boundaries?
So I guess it goes back to that self-reflection piece.
Totally.
The more you understand your values, the better equipped you are to make decisions that feel aligned,
Yeah.
even when they're tough.
And the coach adds that sometimes the separation itself can be a way of honoring your values.
Now wait, how does that work? Explain that one.
Okay, so let's say you really value honesty and integrity.
Right.
If you're in a relationship that's built on lies or secrecy, staying in it might actually be a violation of your values.
Okay.
So the separation, even though it's painful, can be a way of aligning your actions with what you really believe in.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to look at it.
It is.
It's like sometimes letting go is the most honest thing you can do.
Yeah.
Even if it goes against what we've been taught about relationships.
Exactly.
But that takes a lot of strength and self-awareness.
It does.
But it also speaks to this transformative power of this whole experience.
It does.
It's not just about logistics.
No.
It's about these bigger questions.
Oh, big stuff.
About life and love.
Yeah.
And what it means to be true to yourself.
I think this whole process just forces you to really dig deep.
Yeah.
And figure out what you stand for.
And that kind of self-discovery can be really valuable.
It can.
The coach talks about how this period of introspection can lead to a much deeper understanding of your own needs and desires and boundaries.
So it's not just about figuring out what went wrong in the past relationship.
It's about creating a blueprint for healthier connections in the future.
Totally.
Yeah, and both sources highlight how these ripple effects can go way beyond your romantic life.
They do?
They can affect your friendships, your family relationships, even your career.
For sure.
So it's like this one experience can set off a chain reaction
That's true.
of positive changes.
Yeah. And it might not feel like it at the time.
Right.
But those changes are happening.
Yeah, so this whole leveling up thing, it's not just a cheesy metaphor.
It's real.
It's an opportunity for growth and transformation.
It is.
All right, so in the next part, we're going to talk more about this idea of leveling up.
Okay.
And how to actually do it in real life.
Yeah, let's get practical.
So stay tuned.
Can't wait. It really is like leveling up in a video game.
It is. Yeah.
You know, it's not just about surviving the separation.
Right.
But it's like using it as a springboard to become a better version of yourself.
So how do we actually do that? Like, I know we keep talking about self-reflection, but what are some, like, concrete ways that people can use this time to really understand themselves better?
Okay, so the relationship coach in the video uses this metaphor of building a stronger foundation brick by brick.
Okay.
And each brick is like a new piece of self-knowledge.
Okay, so give me an example of a brick.
Okay, one brick could be understanding your attachment style.
Oh, yeah, attachment styles. I've heard of those.
Yeah.
But to be honest, it always seems kind of theoretical.
I know what I mean.
Like, how does knowing that I'm, like, whatever, anxious, preoccupied, or avoidant, or whatever, how does that actually help me in real life?
That's a great question. And actually, the coach addresses that head on.
Okay.
He says once you understand your attachment style, you can start to see the patterns in your relationships.
Okay.
Like maybe you realize you always choose partners who are emotionally unavailable.
Okay.
And it subconsciously mirrors your own childhood. You know, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's about understanding these deeper patterns.
Yeah, and then breaking free from them.
Okay, so now what if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, look, I don't have time for therapy.
Right.
I don't have time for these deep dives into attachment theory. I just need to get through this breakup.
Yeah, what do they do?
What would you say to those folks?
Well, the podcast actually has some good advice for that.
Okay.
They talk about the importance of focusing on things you can control,
What
even when everything feels really chaotic.
Okay, so what kinds of things?
Things like establishing routines,
Well,
taking care of your physical health.
right.
Finding healthy ways to express your emotions.
Right, so it's about those basic self-care things.
Totally. Yeah, because it's so easy to let all that stuff slide when you're hurting.
Yeah.
But it's actually what will make you feel grounded and strong enough to face the emotional stuff.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So those basic things really are important.
Super important.
And they even suggest in the podcast, like creating a playlist
Oh, yeah, I love it.
of uplifting music or podcasts.
Right. Surround yourself with things that inspire you.
Nourish your soul.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's about being intentional about what you're taking in.
What you're feeding your mind and your heart.
Exactly. That reminds me of something the relationship coach said about not letting the separation define you.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the, victim
Oh,
mentality.
totally. Like, woe is me. This is the end of my life.
But he's saying there's a choice to be made.
There is.
You can let this break you, or you can let it make you stronger.
And he talks about how even though the separation might have been initiated by someone else, the way you respond to it is completely in your control.
I love that.
Yeah.
It puts the power back in your own hands.
It does.
But honestly, sometimes I think the pain is just too big to even think about.
Right.
Like leveling up or finding a silver lining.
I get that.
Like, how do you even begin to do that when you're just in so much pain?
Well, both of those sources talk about how the grieving process can be messy, unpredictable. Yeah. And so there are going to be days where you feel like you're taking 2 steps forward, 5 steps back.
Yeah.
And that's normal.
Okay, so it's not about pretending everything's fine.
Right.
It's about being honest about the struggle,
Yes.
but still choosing to move towards something better.
That's it.
So even when it hurts,
Even when it's hard.
you're still choosing to keep going.
Absolutely.
The coach talks about how actually facing those difficult emotions head on
Right.
is what allows you to heal.
Yeah, you got to feel it to heal it.
And he uses this metaphor of a wound.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
If you just keep covering it up with a bandage, it'll never heal.
It'll never heal. You got to clean it out.
Let it air out, even though it stings.
Exactly.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
So how do we know when we've cleaned out the wound enough? Like, is there some signal that, we're ready for the next level, so to speak?
He doesn't give like a hard and fast rule because
Okay.
everyone's journey is going to be different. But he says one sign is when you can start to see the separation as a learning experience,
Okay.
not just a failure.
Interesting.
So you're starting to see the bigger picture.
Instead of just feeling the pain.
Yeah, maybe even feeling some gratitude for what you learned.
And that's a huge step toward finding peace with the decision.
Totally.
Doesn't mean you're happy about it,
Right.
but you're accepting it as part of your story.
Yeah. Okay. What about those values we talked about before?
Yeah.
Those like deep down values that might be clashing with this decision.
Right. How do we find peace when we feel like we're going against what we believe in?
Exactly.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think both sources kind of agree that it's about balance.
Okay.
It's not about abandoning your values,
Right.
but it's also not about letting them dictate your life to the point where you're sacrificing your well-being.
Okay. So it's about being true to yourself and honoring what you believe in, even if it gets messy sometimes.
It will.
Okay. So how do we do that? Any practical tips? The podcast suggests getting really clear on your non-negotiables.
Yeah.
Like, what values are you absolutely not willing to compromise on, even in a relationship?
Okay.
You know?
That's a great question to ask yourself. What are my non-negotiables?
It is.
Yeah.
And then how can you live out those values in a way that honors your own needs and boundaries?
So I guess it goes back to that self-reflection piece.
Totally.
The more you understand your values, the better equipped you are to make decisions that feel right,
Yes.
even when they're tough.
And the coach adds that sometimes the separation itself
Okay.
can actually be a way of honoring your values.
Okay. How does that work?
Okay, let's say you really value honesty and integrity,
Okay.
but you're in a relationship that's built on lies and secrecy.
Mhm.
Staying in that relationship would actually be a violation of your values.
Okay.
So the separation, even though it's painful, can be a way of aligning your actions with what you believe.
Wow. That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like sometimes letting go is the most honest thing you can do,
Yeah.
even if it goes against what we've been taught about relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah. But that takes a lot of strength and self-awareness.
It does.
Yeah. But it also speaks to this transformative power of this whole experience.
Absolutely.
It's not just about logistics.
Yeah.
It's about these bigger questions.
Yeah, the big stuff.
About a life and love.
Yeah.
And what it means to be true to yourself.
It is. And I think this whole process forces you to really dig deep and figure out what you stand for.
And that kind of self-discovery can be really valuable.
Oh, for sure.
The coach talks about how this period of introspection can lead to a much deeper understanding of your own needs and desires and boundaries.
Right.
So it's not just about figuring out what went wrong in the past relationship.
Right.
It's about creating a blueprint for healthier connections in the future.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And both sources highlight how these ripple effects can go way beyond your romantic life. It can affect your friendships, your family relationships, even your career.
Totally.
So it's like this one experience can set off a chain reaction.
It can.
A positive changes.
And, it might not feel like it at the time.
Right.
But those changes are happening.
Yeah, so this whole leveling up thing,
right.
It's not just a cheesy metaphor.
It's real.
It's an opportunity for growth and transformation.
It's a real opportunity. Yeah, it really is inspiring,
To hear these stories of people turning their separations into, opportunities.
Yeah, for growth.
For growth and, yeah.
I think it shows that even though it feels so isolating,
right.
there's a whole community of people out there who've walked this path and come out stronger.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hey, we get it, this sucks.
Yeah.
But you're not alone, and it does get better.
Exactly.
It's interesting, though, both these sources emphasize that this process isn't just about romantic relationships. The lessons we learn, they say, during this time can, ripple out into all areas of our lives.
Yeah, the podcast specifically talks about how it transforms friendships.
Yeah, so what does that look like?
Well, maybe you start setting healthier boundaries.
Oh.
Or maybe you just become more intentional about who you spend time with.
Okay, and so it's like you're taking these lessons that you're learning.
Right.
And you're applying them to other relationships.
Yeah, totally.
Now, the relationship coach, he talks about how the skills you develop.
Yeah.
So that self-awareness, that emotional resilience.
Right.
Can even make you a better parent.
He says it's about modeling those healthy coping mechanisms.
Okay.
For your kids and just showing them that it's okay to ask for help when you're struggling.
Yeah, so it's not just about protecting your kids from the pain of this separation.
Right.
But it's also about using it to teach them valuable lessons.
Totally.
Yeah, and those lessons can be so powerful.
Yeah.
Especially, for kids who might be going through their own relationship challenges later on.
Right. They'll have those tools.
Yeah. Now, all this talk about, growth and transformation is great.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to acknowledge that this is still a grieving process.
It is.
There's going to be sadness, anger, maybe even guilt or shame.
Oh, the hard stuff.
So how do these sources kind of address that more emotional side of things?
Both sources talk about allowing yourself to feel those emotions fully without judging yourself.
Okay.
It's like riding a wave,
Sure.
You can't control the waves, but you can learn to surf.
So be present with it.
Yeah, just be present with whatever's coming up.
Ride the wave.
Ride the wave, exactly.
And the relationship coach, he talks about being gentle with yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Give yourself permission to have a bad day or cry it out or whatever you need to do to process the pain.
I think that's such good advice.
It is, because it's so easy, especially in our culture today.
Right, just push it down.
Just get over it.
Yeah, keep busy.
But real healing takes time.
It does.
And both sources emphasize that there's no one-size-fits-all timeline.
Totally.
Everyone grieves differently.
And that's okay.
Speaking of timelines, though, what about those situations where, one person's ready to move on, but the other person is still hoping for reconciliation?
Yeah, that's tough.
How do you navigate that kind of mismatch?
The podcast suggests having really open and honest conversations about where each person is at.
Okay, so just being real with each other.
Yeah, even if it's hard.
Yeah. And the relationship coach adds that it's important to be clear about your own intentions.
Yes, totally.
If you're not open to reconciliation, you got to communicate that.
You got to be upfront.
Even though it's hard.
It is.
It's a tough conversation.
For sure.
But I think ultimately, it's about being honest with yourself.
Yeah.
And with the other person.
Honesty, even when it's painful, can be a gift.
And it can also prevent further hurt down the road. One thing that really struck me about both these sources is how much they emphasize that the goal isn't just to survive the separation, but to thrive.
To thrive afterward.
They're so optimistic about the potential for growth.
I love that about them.
Yeah, that optimism is contagious.
It is.
Makes me think of that quote, what is it? The wound is the place where the light enters you.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's even though it's painful, it can crack us open.
Yeah.
Allow for deeper healing and a more profound connection to ourselves.
I love that visual.
Yeah, and that path might look different for everyone.
For sure.
For some people, it might be a new relationship that's more fulfilling.
Or a deeper sense of self-love.
Independence. But the important thing is that we give ourselves permission to explore the possibilities, to dream big, to believe that something beautiful can emerge from the ashes.
And I think that's what the podcast and the coach are trying to say. There's hope.
So for anyone out there who's going through a separation, or maybe considering one,
you're not alone.
You're not alone. And even though it might feel like the end,
Right.
it's actually beginning.
The new chapter.
Yeah. So we encourage you to take the insights that we've shared today and
Yes.
use them to navigate your own journey.
There's no right or wrong way to do this.
Yeah.
You have the strength to come out of this stronger and more connected to yourself than ever before.
And if you're feeling lost or overwhelmed,
Reach out for support.
yeah, you don't have to go through this alone.
There are people who care about you.
So take a deep breath, trust the process, and know that even though it might not feel like it right now, there is hope
There is.
for healing and happiness on the other side of this. All right, that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.